Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Sherene Seikaly or Sherene Seikaly. I am the editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies at the Institute for Palestine Studies, which is hosting this event. And I also am an associate professor of history at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And I'm presently in Berlin at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. And it's my really great honor to be hosting today my friend and comrade Raz Segal. I'm going to introduce him and then we're going to talk about a piece that actually came together through exchanges that we had at a particular moment. So Dr. Segal is an associate professor of Holocaust and Genocide studies, and he is an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide at Stockton University. He has held a Harry Frank Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and he was recently a senior fellow at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies in 2023. His publications include Genocide in the Carpathians, War, Social Breakdown, and Mass Violence, 1914-1945, published by Stanford University Press in 2016. And he served as guest editor of the Hebrew language special issue on genocide, mass violence, and cultural erasure of Zmenim, a historical quarterly in 2018. He is presently at work on a book on the distortion, weaponization, and mobilization of Holocaust history in the reproduction of white supremacy and state violence, including a focus on Israel's assault on Palestinians from the 1948 Nakba to the current genocidal assault on Gaza. In addition to scholarly publications, he has published op-eds, book reviews, and larger articles on genocide, state violence, and memory politics in Hebrew, English, and German in The Guardian, the LA Times, The Nation, Jewish Currents, 972 Magazine, Time Magazine, Forward, Berliner Zeitung, and he has appeared on Counterpoints, MSNBC, Al Jazeera English, Democracy Now!, and ABC News. We're so happy to have you with us.
Thank
Welcome.
you, thank you so much, Sherene, and thank you for everyone and Institute for Palestine Studies and the Journal for Palestine Studies for organizing this and making this possible. Very much looking forward to the discussion.
So I'm going to just jump right in to discuss your wonderful piece that we featured in the Journal of Palestine Studies and its kind of trajectory. You began this piece in March of 2023 with the settler attack on Hawara in the West Bank. And it was really this very juncture that you and I had begun corresponding. I think that was the first time we exchanged emails. And in many ways, I look back to that extreme escalation as an important turning point for the times we are in today. And at the time, you had shared with me the February 2023 statement of scholars in Holocaust and genocide studies and related fields on the attack of the Israeli army in the Palestinian city of Jenin on January 26, 2023, which you organized. So I wonder if before we get into the kind of nuts and bolts of your piece, maybe you can tell us about this statement and also the place of Hawara in the realities that we face today.
Yeah, well, that statement from early February, we finalized the statement on 4th of February, and we published it in Jadaliyah on 9th of February. And it was really a result of, what I think people who signed the statement, of course, but I think many others also in Holocaust and genocide studies and related fields, people dealing with human rights and related issue, what these people actually saw unfolding in front of their eyes, right? And I think it's easiest perhaps to cite from the statement just several sentences that really clarify, why we wrote this statement and what's its significance in the broader picture. So I'm quoting here from the statement. We were referring, as you said, to the Israeli attack on the Palestinian city of Jenin in the end of January. This deadly attack is a culmination of a marked escalation of Israeli military and settler violence against Palestinians in the last year. Israeli forces and settlers killed at least 220 Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem in 2022. We said then the largest annual figure since the Second Intifada. And in less than 1 month in 2023, Israeli forces have already killed 30 Palestinians, leaving dozens of others injured and wreaking havoc on cultural and religious sites, crops, water sources, buildings, and streets. Israeli military and settler violence against Palestinians is a structural element of Israeli society and politics. We continued, rooted in the killings and expulsions of more than 750,000 Palestinians, and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages in the 1948 war and the Nakba, the imposition of a military regime over Palestinians who remained as citizens in Israel that lasted from 1948 to 1966, and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem since the 1967 war. We then further said that this history has now reached a particularly violent threshold with the new Israeli government, which presents an explicit and unabashed agenda of Jewish supremacy over all of Palestine, Israel. It has already begun translating this agenda into anti-Palestinian policies and actions, continuing and intensifying further an already violent history. End of quote. So I think it's clear that what we were doing in the statement is we were warning that a very long process of Israeli settler-colonial violence was reaching an extremely violent point. And very importantly, we were, of course, also warning that worse is likely to come. We actually wrote in the statement, there's a sentence there that says, the red lights are flashing for all of us to see. So as I said, the statement was published on 9th of February. And a massive settler attack, as you said, on Hawara took place then at the end of February, and a week later, the settler attack on family in Hawara with which I begin the piece. It's important then to also stress that the following month, right after February were just filled with Israeli settler violence, right? Destroying, incarcerating, humiliating, killing on a daily basis. And this is all, of course, in the service of realizing the settler colonial vision of a greater Israel with, as few Palestinians as possible and as many Jews as possible. And we know that from January to early October 2023, Israeli authorities, the Israeli army, Israeli settlers killed nearly 200 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and created such an atmosphere of terror that, basically left almost no Palestinians in a large swath of territory east of Ramallah to the outskirts of Yericho. Then came the Hamas-led attack on Israel on October 7th and Israel's subsequent genocidal assault on Gaza. So the red lights, as we wrote, were very much flashing in 2023. They were, of course, flashing well before that. Now, I can't speak for the scholars who signed the statement, but for me, noticing red lights and raising the alarm is one of the rationales of my field of Holocaust and genocide studies. That was one of the goals of the statement. We can talk a bit more about the field later. And in terms of raising the alarm, so this is what we call genocide prevention, really, right? If we're thinking about genocidal violence, then the task, of course, of preventing genocide, and the idea of genocide prevention is that, you prevent the genocide before it actually unfolds and assumes, wholly destructive proportions, dimensions. But the task of preventing genocide in Gaza, of course, has failed because in the last 14 months, Israel has thoroughly destroyed Gaza. But it has actually become beyond urgent to prevent the intensification of Israeli settler-colonial violence in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem from assuming genocidal proportions, right? And we know that this is on the table for the Israeli state. And it is equally urgent to stress also here that Palestinian citizens of Israel are also in grave danger, right? As the Israeli state has actually moved now after October 7th, 2023, to treat them explicitly as enemies. And of course, we know that this view stretches back to 1948, to the Nakba, to the 156,000 Palestinians who survived and remained within what became Israel. They were immediately placed by the Israeli state under military rule, right? So the state actually saw them explicitly as enemies. And we know that the Israeli police commissioner, Kobi Shabtai, confirmed the persistence of this view of Palestinians as enemies when he threatened in October 2023 to expel to Gaza Israeli Palestinians identifying with Palestinians in Gaza. And we know that the Israeli police then arrested hundreds of Israeli Palestinians for any expressions of sympathy with Palestinians in Gaza, including the cruel and dehumanizing arrest in April 2024 of internationally renowned Palestinian scholar Nadira Shalab-Kevorkian in her home in Jerusalem. And Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right settler who serves as Israel's Minister of National Security, terrorized Palestinians further by disturbing thousands of weapons after October 2023 to Israeli Jewish civilians to form quote-unquote self-defense units. And this is in an atmosphere where in Israeli media, politics, culture, on the streets, in public spaces, there is celebrations of genocidal violence, of murdering of children, indeed of Israeli soldiers and officers documenting their own crimes in Gaza and uploading them proudly to social media. So indeed, Israeli Palestinians are in grave danger as well. And if we think about prevention, which was again one of the goals of that statement back in early 2023, then we're definitely still in that space. One last thing to say about that statement is another one of our goals was to call to forefront in Holocaust and genocide studies Palestinian scholars and students and their work on the ongoing Nakba, which of course remains an urgent task. And it's important to say, and we might, again, maybe come back to that as well, that Journal of Genocide Research, under the leadership of senior editor Dirk Moses, and that's alone among all the journals in my field of Holocaust and genocide studies, has actually taken up this issue of forefronting Palestinian scholars and students before October 7th even, but actually much more in the last 14 months. So that was about the kind of the statement that
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And, I remember sort of being in this time of just intensive vigilance around the growing settler, uh, the consolidation of settler governance in Israel, right? With this very right-wing government that was, through people like Ben-Gvir, really explicitly calling for settler violence on Palestinians in the West Bank. And I remember feeling such a time of crisis, and many of us, on the Journal of Palestine Studies and far beyond in Palestinian studies, really seeing this kind of escalating Nakba in front of us. And as you say, a Nakba that has consistently crossed the fragmented lines of Israeli colonization. And I remember also feeling a great deal of relief to receive your email and you're asked, can we publish the statement on Jadaliya at the time? And from that time on, as sort of the, full-scale genocide began in October, a great deal of relief also for your voice and everything that you've contributed from within your field and your particular position. I wanted to maybe think together about the intersections of our fields in many ways of genocide and Holocaust studies and Palestinian studies through the language of the pogrom, because I think in the as we were watching Hawara in 2023, one of the things that at the time Rashid Khalidi and I, as co-editors of the Journal of Palestine Studies, were kind of inviting people to say, we don't need to call this a pogrom. We have a word for this, and that word is Nakba. And I think, one of the things that the Journal of Palestine Studies has been really intentional about has been to insist on kind of the terms that come from within a Palestinian tradition, and to also, because I think in many ways Palestine is a place that is so compelling to so many people, that it is really important to also understand it as productive of theories and concepts and ideas and so forth. And you touch on this too, in the beginning of your piece, which I just want to, Laura Albust has very generously put in the link in the chat, but I will just share the title, which is Settler Anti-Semitism, Israeli Mass Violence, and the Crisis of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which we were really proud to publish in our issue that is here shared online and also in print. And so I wanted to invite you to talk with us about this word pogrom and historicize it for us.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I agree completely about the importance of using, the language of Nakba uh, to describe and to explain Israeli settler-colonial violence from its beginning, as I've just mentioned, from 1948 until today. And, I think it's important to mention in this context, Palestinian legal scholar Rabia Agbaria's recent argument that we should actually consider Nakba as a new legal concept, a new concept in international law, actually, to think about the crime of Nakba, right? Um, Now, in the article, I refer to the description of the settler attack on Hawara, as you said, at the end of February, as a pogrom, and I mentioned this in order to refer to this description, even in Israeli mainstream press. I think it came up because the violence so resembled, certainly kind of in Jewish Israeli eyes, but also beyond that, I think pogrom violence, especially in the burning of parts of the Hawara during the attack. But I mentioned this in order to demonstrate actually the possibilities for the comparison of Israeli settler-colonial violence with historical violence against Jews. I mean, well before the Holocaust, but actually also during and after the Holocaust. And I raised this use of pogrom, right, and this potential comparison because I make an argument in the article, and we'll get to that, about the way in which the Israeli state has actually reproduced the ideologies and the political structures that had targeted Jews for exclusion and discrimination and persecution and violence and ultimately destruction during World War II, and actually continue to target Jews today in various ways. So I wanted to, put this in this framework, right, of thinking comparatively because of the way that Israel has actually produced ideologies and political structures that have targeted Jews. But there's another issue here that I raised this, the use of pogrom, again, in the way that it was understood in the Israeli mainstream press, also because otherwise the dominant critical comparisons of Israel to other states, right? Often think about uh, these comparisons another way and usually choose states like, for example, Hungary and Poland, and think about Israel, what's happening in Israel in the last couple of decades in the frame of illiberalism, quote unquote, right? So I wanted to forefront this potential of comparing Israeli state violence in other ways, right? That was also actually reflected even in Israeli mainstream press in early 2023, because I do think that there's some, big problems, as I explained in the article, with the comparison of Israel specifically to Hungary and thinking solely in the frame of illiberalism.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there are questions coming in on settler anti-Semitism. I promise we're going to get to those. I want to turn to the illiberalism point. But before that, I want to just sort of think together about these terms, which is, I think it's really significant that, as you say in this piece, that it is coming from the Israeli public, right? In Israeli public mainstreams where this language of the pogrom is being brought to bear. And I think what that invites me to think about is how can catastrophe or disaster only become visible when it looks just like something else that is more familiar, that is more accepted. So I think one of our struggles is really and I think one of the things that you do really powerfully in this work is to think beyond the just like, right? To think also about historical difference. So with that, I wanted to give you the question of, you do highlight in particular in this piece the comparison of Israel to Hungary that has prevailed in considerations of this kind of illiberalism and more broadly the crisis of liberalism as we're living it internationally. Talk to us about the obfuscations of that comparison.
Yeah. Um, I think that maybe again I'll quote here just, I say in the article that the comparison of Hungary to Israel assumes that both states are democracies in the process of sliding to authoritarianism, or we could say liberalism, with the former, that is Hungary, farther ahead and thus offering warning signs for the latter, for Israel. I write, one need not dig deep to see crucial problems with this assumption. So the first problem, of course, it's important to mention, is that Israel was actually never a democracy, right? And we really need to put this idea to rest, right? And it's especially grotesque, right? This idea that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, right? This idea, and we'll get to later perhaps the way that Israel is viewed, as an exceptional kind of a state in general. So also not just a democracy, but an exceptional democracy. But it was never a democracy. I mean, a state that places hundreds of thousands of people that are its citizens, that is the Palestinian citizens of Israel from the very beginning that I mentioned, 156,000 people. A state that places people like this under military rule, right, without basic rights from the beginning, from its establishment from 1948 to 1966, that's not a democracy, right? And then in 1967, we have the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, right? With millions of Palestinians now that Israel, holds under military occupation, again, with no rights whatsoever, right? That's not a democracy, right? Now we can think what Israel then is. I mean, of course, Israel is a settler project, right? And Israel is a self-proclaimed nation state of the Jewish people, and we'll get to these things. But if we want to think in terms of international law, then we know that, and in there's in the last 15 years or so, there's a growing and very strong and broad consensus that Israel is an apartheid state, right? And according to the UN Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid from 1973, Israel very much fits this description, a state that aims at, quote, establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them, right? So that's the definition of the crime, a crime against humanity of apartheid. And there's, as I said, a broad and growing consensus that this is what Israel is. In any case, democracy it is not, and it was never a democracy. So the key kind of assumption in the comparison of Israel and Hungary in that sense of democracy sliding to authoritarianism and liberalism is simply not the case. Now, the comparison also, aims precisely then to erase the mountain of evidence about Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. And in the article, I propose to think about the mechanism of disavowal, right? Disavowal of Israeli settler colonialism, and I borrow this from political scientist Kevin Brunel, who used it in really an excellent book from 2021 titled Settler Memory, the Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States. And here, it's important to I'll just quote briefly from Brunel's work to understand what disavowal is in the US context, but it very much fits also in various ways the Israeli context. So he says the following: a key function of the work of settler memory is to shape collective and individual settler subjectivity to legitimate settler governance in relationship to people, territory, and temporality, and to do so in a repetitive, persistent process in which indigenous peoples are constantly woven into the American past and outside the political present. In settler societies, too often these memories are habitually reproduced as a contained and settled matter. It is important to be clear that this settler mnemonic process is not a simple forgetting of indigenous peoples, of settler colonialism, and of white settler identity, but rather disavows of their relevance to the contemporary political context. End of quote here. So disavowing, right, which is exactly what actually this comparison of Israel to Hungary does, it casts what we actually do know about people, right, about places as irrelevant, right, rendering them actually as an absent presence, right, pushing them to the margins as a non-issue. Now, present absence, present absentees is actually the legal term that the state of Israel used for Palestinians who Israeli forces expelled from their homes and lands, but who remained within what became Israel after the 1948 war and the Nakba, right? So there's also this context about disavowing, pushing people to the margins and their claims to the land in various ways, but then also the entire project of Israeli settler colonialism is disavowed in this way. And it's a much more sophisticated mechanism actually than outright denial, because denial actually requires engagement, right? Disavowal is simply making something a non-issue. In practice, of course, we see these kind of mechanisms and others, operate at the same time, also in the Israeli case. So that's the key problem with these kinds of comparisons, and this really, led me in the article and in my thinking, right, to inquire about what is actually the nature, actually, of Israel's settler colonialism that is so urgent, actually, to disavow in this way.
Thank you so much. And, as we all know, the concept of the present absentee and Hadir al-Ghaib has become so prevalent in Palestinian analytical framings and Palestinian poetry and literature, and in kind of the cultural fabric that really captures the fragmentation and this, while the legal notion itself was kind of consolidated as a form of land grab, it also came to really describe the Palestinian condition more broadly as present absent. And I think this careful attention to the distinction between disavowal and denial is really important in that regard. So I think we have 390 people watching us over various platforms. And I think what folks really are curious about is this idea of settler anti-Semitism. So I wonder if you could explain to people how you've come to that term. How does it come at the intersections of empire and the nation state? And how is it that Israel is both a product and an extension of settler anti-Semitism?
Right. So, so I make an argument basically in the piece that Israel is actually, if to put it just, simply, an anti-Semitic state, right? Um, and, one thing that's important to say immediately about this is that this might seem, like an absurd argument, right? How could the Jewish state be an anti-Semitic state? But of course, this seems outlandish or absurd only if we don't pay attention to a key distinction, right, between a people and a state, right? Two different kind of things, right? And of course, the Zionist project, as it manifested itself in the Israeli state, aimed and still aims constantly to collapse this distinction, right, between Jews and the Israeli state. So it's absolutely possible that the Israeli state, like any state, right, actually is an anti-Semitic state. Now, in order to understand how this came about and what I mean by settler anti-Semitism, so we do need to, of course, understand a bit about anti-Semitism, right? And specifically, when I say anti-Semitism, I mean the modern phenomenon of anti-Semitism that's related, but of course also different than anti-Jewish ideas, policies, and violence in previous periods. Now, it's different because of specifically modern phenomena, that is, of new ways of seeing the world. Primarily, I'm thinking here about ideas about race, right, which are particularly modern and emerge kind of in the 19th century in the world of European empire building and colonialism, and through a new form of collective identity, nationalism, right? So nationalism, race, and of course, nationalism stood and still stands at the heart of the very exclusionary nation-state system that emerges after World War I in Europe, when the empires in Europe collapse, and instead of them comes the new system of nation states. So let's start with this, right? With the nation state system. Of course, the exclusionary idea is that the new nation states, in contrast to the empires that had collapsed, right, are owned by a hegemonic group, right? So now, instead of multi-ethnic and multilingual and multi-religious empires, right, we have states. We have Hungary for people understood and identified by the state, right, nationally as Hungarians. Poland for Poles, Germany for Germans, and so on, and so forth. Now, of course, everyone not part of the hegemonic group in that framework, right, does not really belong in those states, right? So the idea of thinking about the new nation state system in relation to the imperial world is not a nostalgic idea about the imperial world where everything was, was great, because it wasn't, of course, right? It's more about the idea that people's belonging, essential belonging to place, was not constantly questioned, right? And that's what we have in the new nation state system, right? That people's belonging to place, even if they had lived there for generations, right, is now questioned, right? That's why we also live in this era that turns people and places into questions and problems, right? The Jewish question, the Transylvanian question, the Macedonian question, the Armenian question, so on and so forth, right? That is their belonging to place, right? Now, European states, of course, played key roles in formulating and spreading anti-Semitic ideas and in designing and enacting anti-Semitic policies. And we can maybe get into this a bit later, right? The particular nature of anti-Semitic state violence in Europe. But this is one piece of modern anti-Semitism, right? The nation state, the exclusionary nation state, national identities, and of course, on that, people, the new way of understanding collective identities as defined by the state through nationalism. There's also the added element of racism, right? Of race. So people are understood collectively in national terms, but also in racial terms. So this brings me to the second piece, to this intersection of the nation state system and the European empire building and the colonial world, because we know that recent scholarship has actually shown how European imperialism gave rise to anti-Semitism, again, as a truly modern phenomena, by placing Jews really as central in discourses about race, and by infusing anti-Jewish conspiracies with new meanings, but now on a truly global scale that was also tied to the economic system of imperialism, that is capitalism, right? Now, so there's a new set of ideas that emerge, right? And also, very important to say, start to contradict each other, right? And we'll see why that matters when we come to the Israeli case in a second. So the ideas are Jews, for example, powerful people using their assimilation in empire states like France and Germany to pursue these kinds of devious goals of global control, for example? So this anti-Semitic idea of Jews who want to control the world, or were they kind of primitive people similar to their neighbors in lands conquered by European powers, such as Arab-speaking Jews in North Africa? So are they all powerful, or are they actually primitive, right? But the scale of European empire building and colonialism, so we have a new kind of way of thinking about Jews, right? Again, and that's why we have these contradictions, right? Both powerful and now primitive in relation also to ideas about race. So are Jews actually sometimes senior colonial administrators, for example, in German colonies in Africa, right? Or are Jews what they are portrayed as in contemporary research in a host of disciplines from, serology to anthropology? Are they actually a separate and inferior race, right? Again, also in relation to people under colonial occupation in Africa. So there's all these kinds of new ideas about Jews that have to do with power, but also then with inferiority in race terms. And it's not by coincidence then that, French and Italian settlers and colonial authorities in North Africa, for example, played key roles in efforts to discriminate, exclude, disenfranchise, attack, and remove Jews in France and Italy in the colonies, but also then in the European centers well before and during World War II. So this is what I call, the emergence of settler anti-Semitism, that we have these new ideas emerge in the world of European empire building and colonialism. And it's particularly, right, in where we have these kinds of settler colonial contexts, for example, in French and Italian occupied North Africa, that the most intense and extreme ideas about excluding and removing and attacking Jews emerge. Now, we can think about this sort of racialization of Jews also in the United States, for example, and the way that in which it functions within processes of assimilation that transforms immigrants into settlers. In this case, we can think about Jews into settlers, right? But if we think about the history of anti-Semitism in the US, right, and of Jews really as an ultimate other of white supremacy, of settler colonialism, then Jews always remain second-class settlers in the US system. They can never really become, right, American. They're always American Jews. They can never really become settlers that really overcome, indeed, settler anti-Semitism. Now, so with this in mind now, right, thinking about the nation state on the one hand and the your imperial and colonial world, and indeed how they intersect, right, in the late 19th and early 20th century, we come to Israel, right? Now, the issue with Israel is that white supremacy, and again, Jews are an ultimate other of white supremacy, but in Israel, white supremacy has manifested itself actually as Jewish supremacy, right? Which is a very paradoxical final destination, for there is a racialization of Jews within processes of European imperialism and colonialism, but it's also a destination that dissolves exactly the contradictions inherent in modern anti-Semitism as an imperial and colonial phenomena. Because in Israel, Jews assume the ultimate, actually, manifestation of whiteness, political power according to the European nation state model, right? So they were therefore not, as in the US, say immigrant settlers, right? But settlers actually now in the fullest sense of the term, and therefore also agents of state settler anti-Semitism, right? Now, again, it's important to say that Israel emerged as the declared, right, nation state of the Jewish people. So it's a nation state by definition, by its own definition, right? But it's also a settler state. And, you know, we can think about and we can discuss. We don't really have time for this here, but there's a very long discussion about this, about the way that Zionists and Israelis themselves understand the Israeli state project as a settler project. But we can also think about the state's, laws, right? And then it's enough if we think about the 2018 Jewish nation state basic law. I mean, Israel doesn't have a constitution, so it has a set of basic laws. Instead, the 2018 Jewish nation state basic law, which is of course about the Israeli nation state, the Jewish nation state, is also a law that uses explicit settler language, right? In Article 7, for example, it says that the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation, right? So Israel is indeed at the intersection, right, of the ideologies and political structures, right, that anti-Semitism and settler anti-Semitism particularly, right, as a settler state, that had targeted Jews and actually continue to target Jews today. So this is, in a nutshell, right, the article that I make in the article, the argument that I make in the article about settler anti-Semitism. It's just important to add here, if I can, Sherene, that Israel has in that sense reproduced, right, settler anti-Semitism, but it actually also extended it, right? But because what we see in Israel is actually an attack on Jewish identities that do not conform or that threaten the project actually of creating a white Jewish settler state and society, right? And I want to, in this sense, in this context, just mention, very briefly that Israeli settler anti-Semitism manifested itself internally in the racist marginalization and discrimination and state violence against Arab-speaking, as Mizrahi, Jews as an integral part of creating this white Jewish settler society. And we can think about, and I talk about this in the article, the forced removal and the forced disappearance and the abduction by the Israeli state from 1948 to 1954, the early years of the state, of a few thousand children, newborns to 4-year-olds, from Mizrahi, mostly Yemenite families, a clear case of state violence, right, aimed at actually at babies and children here that are very much in the framework, right, of attacking, right, basically a Jewish identity that does not conform and that indeed actually threatened, right, the project of creating a white Jewish settler society and state, right? So again, we can say more about this, but I know that the time is short, but I just want to mention that in Israel, it was settler anti-Semitism wasn't just reproduced, it was actually extended in this attack on Jewish identities, right? And indeed, again, the Zionist project has manifested itself in the Israeli state from the beginning and until today very much, right, is engaged in attacking, right, in actually now saying that you can only be a Jew, right, if you are a Zionist, right, if you identify with the Zionist project as it manifested itself in the Israeli state, right, and any other way of being a Jew, right, is discredited, is actually considered now now especially in the last year, right, um, as illegitimate, right? As people are actually, we're now in this kind of discourse where Jews who identify with Israel or Israeli Jews and their supporters, right, are tagging anti-Zionist Jews, for example, as not Jews at all. So we have this kind of extension of settler anti-Semitism and this attack on Jewish identities in the Israeli state project from the beginning ongoing until today. So all this in a kind of a nutshell about settler anti-Semitism, a bit of its history and how it's reproduced in the Israeli case.
Thank you so much. And I think here it's also really important, as you've shown us, to keep in mind the dynamic ways that these categories change, like whiteness, coming in and out of whiteness, be it in the United States, and also settler aspiration as kind of itself a mode of becoming white. And a way to think again about the internal racial dynamics within between Mizrahim and Ashkenazim. So I see that we have, I think we're up to over 750 attendees. Thank you all for being with us. I promise, open up to questions from the audience soon, but I do have two more questions for you that I think are really important that get us to the urgent moment that we're in now. You teach us about the crucial role of genocide. And in fact, Dr. Segal Raz was one of the first people to write in, I believe it was October 2023, that what was happening in Israel's assault on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip was a textbook case of genocide. So you talk and you've taught us about the crucial role of genocide, and in particular, Lemkin's coining of the word in the trajectory of settler anti-Semitism. Could you share that with us today?
Lemkin, Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish Polish legal scholar who coined the term genocide in his book from 1944 during World War II, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, he didn't refer, of course, to settler anti-Semitism, but he definitely discussed the way that state anti-Semitism, right, figured within broader visions of the state. And I can think about, I can turn here to specifically the case of Hungary. Part of my own research on the Holocaust focuses on Hungary, but also I think that thinking about the Holocaust in Hungary in the way that Lemkin suggested, right? So think about state anti-Semitism in the broader framework of the vision of the state, in the case of Hungary, of creating a greater Hungary, right? Turns our attention, thinking through Lemkin here, turns our attention to the historical roots, right, of illiberalism in Hungary today that complicate further, right, the comparison that we started with, right, for example, between Israel and Hungary. So if we understand where illiberalism in Hungary comes from, actually, it further shows us that this comparison between these two democracies, Israel and Hungary, is much more complex than it seems. So Lemkin himself, when he was thinking about when he was writing about the Hungarian case, again, during the war, he was talking about the borderlands that Hungary had lost when it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire before World War I, and that it aimed to regain during World War II in order to recreate this Greater Hungary, but now as a kind of ethno-national state only for Hungarians, again defined in national and actually racist terms. And he wrote specifically about the Yugoslav territories that Hungary occupied when it joined Nazi Germany and its allies in attacking and destroying Yugoslavia in April 1944. And he wrote 41, and he wrote the following. He wrote, the Hungarian authorities have introduced a genocide policy by endeavoring to impose a Hungarian pattern on these territories, right? So again, Hungarian pattern, that is a policy that targeted several groups, including Jews, through mass murder, mass deportations, arrest, and torture, right? And the violence to impose the Hungarian pattern stemmed from this drive to realize the ethno-national Greater Hungary, which actually required from Hungary more than just attacking the groups. It also necessitating transferring people that the state, again, regarded as ethnic Hungarians from other places into the state's border. In this case of the Hungarian territories, it was a group of about 14,000 people, 3,000 families of the Bukovina Seikaly who had lived in Romania, and the Hungarian state considered them, right, ethnic, that is national, and race, in race terms, Hungarian. So here it's very interesting, to see that Lemkin's conceptualization of genocide, right, this imposing of a Hungarian pattern, right, was actually rooted also, in this case, in a settler dimension, right? It was violence against Jews in a broader frame of creating a Greater Hungary that also necessitating, right, bringing in, settling people considered Hungarian who had never before lived, right, in those territories, right? And as I said, this points to, as I explained, the place of anti-Semitism as the destructive intersection of settler colonialism and the nation state system, again, as in the Israeli case. So it's, if we think through Lemkin, we do see, right, that Lemkin understood, right, state anti-Semitism and the attack on Jews in this broader framework and the intersection, right, of settler colonialism and the nation state system.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to turn. I have a lot of other questions that have come up in the course of our discussion, but I'm going to give you one final one before I turn to some of the audience's questions. So, as we've been in this now 14 months of interminable grief at the horrors of Israeli genocide in Palestine, tell us about how Holocaust studies has responded to these conditions.
Yeah, well, here I think it's Holocaust and genocide studies, my field, right, um, uh, is in deep crisis since 7th of October, 2023. And I think it's important in order to understand why the field is in deep crisis, right? We have to understand the relationship of the field indeed to Israel, right? And to the case of Israeli state violence against Palestinians, settler violence against Palestinians. And again, this is a case where, well before October 7th, there's a mountain of evidence, right, about Israeli state and settler violence against Palestinians. So what is the relationship of the field to this? Very, very briefly, this actually goes back to the crime of genocide, right? And again, why this is so important for my field, because when the crime of genocide emerges in 1948, right, in the UN, Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the immediate context is what we call today the Holocaust. No one used the term then, but what we call today the Holocaust. And the Holocaust immediately was made, again, what we call today the Holocaust was made exceptional, unique, right? It was made unique in order to disconnect actually the Holocaust indeed from imperial and colonial cases of genocide, right? In order to present Nazism and Nazi genocide as, an accident basically, and an otherwise, history of modern progress, right? And so this idea that the Nazism and the Holocaust is unique also immediately corresponded, right, with the idea that Jews are unique, right, which is actually a central idea in the Judeo-Christian Western civilization. But that also meant that in 1948, when Israel was established through the 1948 war and the Nakba, so the Holocaust was unique, Jews are unique, so Israel, the state, where many Holocaust survivors indeed tried to build their lives, right, was also made unique. So we have this kind of triad of uniqueness, right? The Holocaust, Jews, Israel, unique, right? And unique in relation to the new crime of genocide, right? So what does this unique means actually? That Israel, the state of the Holocaust survivors, were seen immediately as a state that cannot actually perpetrate any crime under international law, let alone genocide, right? Now, because Israel actually emerged, as we said, from the very beginning, right, at the intersection of the nation-state system and settler colonialism, and that it was clear actually to many, many people at the time, right, it was also incredibly urgent to deny, right, Israeli settler colonialism, and of course, the foundational crime of the Israeli state, Nakba, right? So Nakba denial becomes structural, very, very tragically, in the new international legal system with genocide as its key innovation, right? And with this idea that the Holocaust in Jews and Israel is unique. Now, all these things also became very, very foundational and important in Holocaust and genocide studies, right? I mean, think about the name of the field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is a very strange title for a field. If we all recognize that the Holocaust is genocide, right? So what is this Holocaust and Genocide Studies? It's an embodiment of this hierarchy, right? That the Holocaust is unique, right? So ideas about the Holocaust is unique, Jews as unique, and Israel as unique are foundational also in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And because we saw, I mean, because the nature of the Israeli attack on Gaza immediately after 7th of October 2023 was quite clear that we're witnessing extreme violence, extreme mass atrocities, and that we're actually witnessing unfolding genocide, right? This created a massive crisis in the field. Now, I'll just very, very briefly here say, how do we see this this crisis? We see this crisis because there's one group of scholars, mostly scholars who deal with the Holocaust and, in a very narrow sense, the Holocaust, right? Who for them, there's no, business as usual. There's nothing that these people actually justify Israel's attack on Gaza in various ways, and reproduce, the idea that Israel is exceptional, that we cannot, imagine that Israel can perpetrate any crime in international law, let alone genocide, that this is an act of self-defense, so on and so forth. These group of people have actually published a statement on 17th of November that actually more than 150, mostly Holocaust scholars, have signed in the following weeks, that actually place the 7th of October, the Hamas attack, in the frame of the Holocaust, right? And actually then enhance this Israeli depiction, basically, of Palestinians as Nazis, right? This weaponization of the Holocaust, which really creates a world turned upside down, right? I mean, a stateless people under decades of Israeli settler colonialism, siege, military occupation, and mass violence are now depicted as the ultimate, basically, not just the perpetrator, but the ultimate perpetrator in modern imagination, Nazis, right? And a very powerful state backed by powerful allies, really a nuclear power, right? Israel is now portrayed as not just the victims, but as the ultimate victim, right, of modern imagination, Jews facing Nazis. So this is what these scholars did, right? And their 17th of November statement, which is, horrific, right? That people dealing with genocide would do such a thing. But this is, again, emerges from this foundational issue in the field that sees Holocaust Jews and Israel as unique. And then on the other hand, there are scholars, and again, mostly scholars that deal more broadly with genocide and mass atrocities, but also some scholars who were very central in shaping the field who deal specifically with the Holocaust. And I'm thinking about, Marion Kaplan, about Omer Bartov, about Barry Trachtenberg, right? Who saw things very differently. And on 9th of December, right, published a statement that about 60 scholars, and again, some of them very influential and central figures in the field, placed, referred to evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Israel's assault on Gaza, placed this in the broader framework of the ongoing Nakba, talked about the legal obligations of states that ratified the UN Genocide Convention to stop and prevent genocide. And this statement from 9th of December also, and I quote here, asked scholars, programs, centers, and institutes in Holocaust and genocide studies to take a clear stance against Israeli mass violence and join in efforts to stop it and prevent its further escalations. Now, it's important to say that, in January, we had the provisional ruling of the International Court of Justice in the case that South Africa brought against Israel, the case of genocide and its attack on Gaza, and the provisional ruling of the ICJ in January, and then two additional ones in March and May, right, stated that it's plausible, right, that Israel is perpetrating genocide in Gaza. We also then had the request for arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan. In May 2024, arrest warrants against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel's War Minister Yoav Gallant, now former minister, as well as against Hamas leaders. And just recently, 6 months later, right, we indeed have the court issued the arrest warrants, right? All this means that the unspeakable, right, in the frame of Holocaust and genocide studies, right, the unspeakable that Israel can definitely perpetrate, right, crimes under international law and perhaps even genocide, right, in international law, according to the ICJ, and then crimes against humanity and war crimes, according to the International Criminal Court. All this is happening, right? So it has further intensified this deep crisis in Holocaust and genocide studies because it touches on on this foundational issue, the relationship of the field to Israel, and the way that Israeli state and settler violence against Palestinians has been disavowed in the field, right? For a long time, decades before the 7th of October. But now also this deep crisis, right? This really major split in the field, right? Is also then a possibility for significant change, right? Also, as I said, because there are major scholars, including Jews, including Israeli Jews, right? If we think about Omer Bartov, for example, in addition to myself, right? That are very clear about what we're all seeing in front of our eyes, right? And indeed about the need to change, if we think about the field, how we're thinking about Israel, right, in the present, but also in the past, in Holocaust and genocide studies. As I said at the beginning, we're also already seeing this process of potential change, significant change in Holocaust and genocide studies, where we look at the Journal of Genocide research. So it's a deep crisis, but it's also potential for some significant change.
Thank you so much. And I think, we're all kind of at that crossroads where we see the ongoing impunity that Israel practices every day in the Gaza Strip, day after day, as really a kind of somehow both shocking and not surprising instance of broader realities that we've been subject to and brought into the world with. I think in particular, I wanted to, just make 3 points really quickly. One is which I think for me, it's always important, or it has been important to hold tightly to the fact that it was really some Holocaust survivors who were very important in the formation of anti-Zionism. And I think sometimes I feel like, the Israeli state often makes claims about speaking on behalf of the Holocaust when in many ways, as many scholars have shown, that hasn't always been the case. But more than anything, I feel like in this moment, we are really witnessing the weaponization of genocide to justify genocide. So I think being in Berlin right now, as one of my colleagues said to me, we are learning all the wrong lessons from our history. So I think I will take us. I know that there's a lot of gratitude in the webinar chat. I've seen also some questions there. If you have questions, I ask only that you put them in the question answer box. So I'm going to give you 3 questions so that you can just kind of pick and choose as you wish. One is to comment on recent reports on settler-owned companies preparing to build settlements in Gaza. We just saw that today on social media. Another is a question of genocide as a crime punishable by death in Israel. How is this reconcilable with actions of the government? And a third is to review the use of the term anti-Semitism. And I think this third one is linked to something that I saw in the discussion itself, which is um, in the webinar chat, which is, historically it's been used exclusively to describe, anti-Semitism has been used to describe Judeophobia. Today we have more and more non-Jewish Semitic population decrying that usage, also considering the fact many Jews are not Semitic. So this is an argument that links the terminology to a place of origin. I have a lot to say about that, but I want to hand it over to you.
Well, I think what I want to address is this issue of the open and explicit discourse in Israel, Israeli politics and society about building settlements in Gaza now. And I want to address this because, it's incredible how we're seeing an open, and we've been seeing this since October, right? Israeli leaders, Israeli politicians, but also in Israeli media and in social media, and anyone who follows Hebrew language, the Hebrew language press and social media in the last 14 months is exposed to really, shocking, as you say, on the one hand, extremely shocking. On the other hand, if you really know something about Israel, not that surprising, because of course the dehumanization of Palestinians that has exploded, right, since October 2023 is nothing new in Israeli politics and society, for example, right? So as you said, on the one hand, shocking, but on the other hand, not really surprising. So we've seen, And that's part of the crime of genocide in Israel's attack on Gaza, the issue of intent, right? That is so important in the crime of genocide. And we've seen Israeli leaders express this intent, you know, from 7th of October onwards, in, dozens and dozens of times, using various mechanisms of dehumanizing Palestinians, using religious language, right, with describing Palestinians as Amalek, for example, right, the biblical story of Amalek. And we still see these expressions actually of explicit intent to destroy Palestinians. Just recently, Israel's finance minister, the far-right settler Bezalel Smotrich, very explicitly in a speech, right, said that Israel, needs to occupy all of Gaza, control all of Gaza, and that there's an opportunity in the coming months, right, to basically cut the population of Gaza, of Palestinians in Gaza, in half, right? It's just recently, right? Now, why do I want to, focus on this? And, we've seen, we've seen Israeli politicians and leaders, right, attend since October, but also just recently outside of Gaza, actually, public conferences, public events, right, about the coming settlement of Gaza, right? And of course, what we're seeing in Gaza is indeed Israeli settler colonialism taking to its, logical conclusion, right? This is what the Gaza genocide is about, right? It's about another stage of creating the greater Israel vision. Now, why is this so important? Because it places the support for Israel, the U.S. support for Israel, right, in a particularly shocking light. Again, shocking on the one hand, but not really surprising if you think about it, because the whole project of Israeli settler colonialism, right, is supported by the U.S. for decades, at least from 1967, right, onwards. Now, why do I mention the U.S. support here in relation to what we all see in front of our eyes, these declarations of intent, right, and settler colonialism and settlement in Gaza, right? Because many people have said, how is it that with everything that we see in front of our eyes, we see this continued, right, U.S. support for Israel? And there's many kind of ways to answer that, right? Israel as a proxy for U.S. interests in the Middle East, arms, arms trade, international arms trade. A lot of people are, not a lot of people actually, but people are making a lot of money from the arms trade and so on and so forth. But this actually goes to the heart of the matter, because what we're seeing right now is the masks have fallen, not only in Israel, but also in the US, about US settler colonialism, right? This is why we see this support at all costs, because if we actually come to terms with what Israel is doing, with what it's telling us that it's doing, right, with this discourse about settling Gaza now, right, then we also have to come to terms. I mean, this kind of takes the settler colonial genie out of the bottle, right? And it's out of the bottle everywhere, also in the US, where settler colonialism, as I started with Brunel, right, is disavowed, is denied, is rationalized, is marginalized in various ways. So when we put this in a broader, in a broader perspective, right, we're really in a, and when we think about, right, also the way that international law has always operated, right, to exceptionalize Israel, right, to serve Western interests, right, but now, right, unwillingly, it is changing, right, because the evidence of the crime are so in our face in such a shocking, again, not very surprising, but such a shocking way, right? So we're in a very critical moment, and these kinds of discourses about settling Gaza, for example, but there's many other things that we can bring to this, right? The videos of the thousands of videos of Israeli officers and soldiers, right, for example, and other issues, right? All this points to the, really critical moment, this critical moment that is horrendous and horrible. It's about total destruction, right? It's also a moment that has the potential to create significant change and indeed, right, help us in what I began with when we think about that statement about Horara that we started with, right? Um, Prevent, right, the further escalation of Israeli settler-colonial violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and against Israeli Palestinians to assume genocidal proportions, right? But it also points to a broader struggle that is taking place against incredible power, absolutely, but a broader struggle that is taking place and has the potential, right, to lead us to a different kind of a future. So yes, we are seeing, horrendous destruction, and that, there's no other way to think about it, right? And genocide is final in this kind of a way. Gaza is destroyed, right? But we're also in a moment that has a potential for, envisioning and continuing a struggle for a real decolonial future. Again, we're up against incredible power, but there is this potential.
Absolutely. And I think that's, yeah, that's a really powerful invitation to think about potential. And along those lines, I think it's also really important to center movements. And there, I think, indigenous movements, the movement for Black Lives, movements, labor movements across, the globe have really come together in this moment in different and very important ways to think about what Palestine and Palestinians can teach us as they survive genocide. Um, I'm gonna kind of give you two last questions, and they're a little bit related. So there's three more questions. Two of them I think are very related, which is how can give us the tools to think about how settler anti-Semitism um, and its position towards Jewish people in Israel really extends to and relates to Palestine and Palestinian peoplehood. And I think you've answered that question, but people just might need a little bit more. Um, and then I think I'll end with the last question, which is really about this global moment of illiberalism, if we want to call it that. I know there's a big debate about, do we call what we're witnessing fascism now or not? Is it fascism? But one of our questions is, how do we understand and combat this widespread reality of an extreme right? Trump, Le Pen. We saw Netanyahu just today, in conversation with one of Romania's kind of, most right-wing, extreme right-wing figures. So how the question asks, with these direct connections to actual Nazis, how do we, envision a future in which we're fighting? The person is saying fighting, Islam is suggesting fighting anti-Semitism, but I would really say what the invitation here and what is really important about the work that you do, Raz, in conversation with all of our works is how do we move beyond exceptionalizing, right, anti-Semitism and seeing it as part of a broader pattern of racism against indigenous people, against Black people, against, against the colonized.
Yeah, I mean, I think that so there's two pieces here, and I'll be very brief. I know that we only have about 8, 9 more minutes. So settler anti-Semitism, right, and anti-Semitism was always tied, was always tied to the broader framework, as a modern phenomenon, to the broader framework of racism and to targeting other racialized groups. I mean, we can think about, there's terrific research, the last decade about these entanglements. Again, if we think about North Africa and entanglements of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, right? Again, within French and Italian, colonial occupation and rule in North Africa. So just to answer this question, in the Israeli case, when we think about settler anti-Semitism, I mentioned how it was extended and to attack Jewish identities, right, that did not conform and that threatened actually the Zionist project and its manifestation in the Israeli state. But of course, because anti-Semitism always attacked Jews in broader frameworks, right, of envisioning empire and European nation states, right? And also, of course, in the Israeli case, settler anti-Semitism, indeed, as you said, Sherene, was central in the attack against the indigenous population in Palestine, Palestinians, right? That's how we need to understand, of course, the Israel as an anti-Semitic state, primarily in its attack against the indigenous population of the land, Palestinian. Now, settler anti-Semitism in the Israeli case also, again, if we don't collapse the distinction between a people and a state and a state, then it's not that shocking actually to think about Israel as an anti-Semitic state. But also, as you said, when we think about how anti-Semites and fascists and actual Nazis, right, white supremacists in the US, right, regard Israel as a model, right, for an ethnic state, for a racial state, right? They hate Jews, but they admire Israel, which again points us to the difference between a state and a people. They point us to this difference, right? Anti-Semites and white supremacists and actual Nazis. As you say, why do they so admire Israel? Because they see, right? They see that Israel has indeed reproduced, right? The ideologies and the political structures, as I argued, that had targeted Jews and other racialized people, right, in the frame of nationalism and colonialism and European empire building. So that's to answer that question. Now, what do we do? First of all, I want to, I really, following also on what I said before, I think it's important to say that we see an incredible support of the US state, right, in Israel. That's kind of, really the Biden administration, right, has provided, this is really Israeli-US genocide, right? That's how we should be thinking about it, right? And the US government is fully complicit in this genocide. But that's not true for a lot of people in US society, right? And we've seen the largest protest movement in the US since the Vietnam War. We've seen protest movement around the world. This protest movement that used actually the language of genocide, right, was central, right, then in actually pushing South Africa actually to, or at least I think there's an argument to be made there. We don't know exactly, right, what happened eventually in the that led South Africa to submit the case against Israel in the ICJ, but there's definitely a connection there between large protest movements in the US and around the world and the ICJ case, and then the ICC request for arrest warrants and arrest warrants. And we saw the encampments movement in US campuses and in campuses and other campuses around the world, right? Hundreds and hundreds of campuses, right? Solidarity encampments with Gaza. And here it's actually, this is where I would say what to do. And I'm speaking here as an, as a scholar. The evidence for Israeli settler colonialism and the evidence for Israeli genocide in Gaza since October 2023 is overwhelming. And we're also facing, right, a continued assault of disavowing it, of denying it, right? And we need to insist on this truth, right, at all costs. But what does that mean? That means exactly actually what we saw in the encampments, right? This means collective action, but this also means collaborative action. right? So we need to work, right, create collaborations. And this is what happened in the encampments, right? There were Jews and Muslims and Palestinians and others, right, who came together, right, in these collaborations. And and when I say collective and collaborative, I mean that this is a very challenging task, right, to work across differences and across various obstacles in making these collaborations. But if we manage to insist on this truth, right, and we've seen already the impact of insisting on truth, right, in this massive movement around the world, right, against Israel's attack on Gaza, against Israeli settler colonialism, I think there's many when we can think about how this then also plays into BDS, right? For example, but creating this collective and collaborative efforts at insisting on truth, right? And I'll just give one example right here in the minutes that I have left, right? We know that in US universities today, there's new regulations this semester, and moving forward, we'll see more repression, right, of actually insisting on truth in the academic world, right, which is supposed to be committed to truth and to research and to documented reality, right? So in the academic world, right, we can insist together, faculty and students, right, more than even than what has happened already in the last year, right, on the truth of what we all see, right, in front of our eyes. It's not something that requires digging, right? It's all in front of our eyes, right? So this is it's risky. There's a lot of consequences. It's scary. We're entering another Trump presidency, so the clampdown will be even more intense. We know all this, right? But this only means that insisting on truth together, right, and in a collaborative way across differences, right, creating this collaboration, right, is incredibly important. There's much more to say about all this, but in the little time that I have, this is
Yeah,
what I want to say. Insisting on truth. Truth is also, by the way, one of the lessons of the Holocaust. So as a Holocaust scholar, I can say that insisting on truth, right, is also so important for me personally, but also professionally.
absolutely. And I would just say, I think two or three things, which is that I would really urge people to subscribe to the Journal of Palestine Studies, to read and circulate Raz's piece, as well as the many other pieces in this issue, coming from testimonies from Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza on the present genocide, as well as analysis of music and digital archives, as well as a response to the weaponization of feminism as a justification of genocide. And I also want to say that, in this very issue, in my editor's note, I talk about Nakba denialism as a central component of conducting a genocide, which is to deny it. And in that regard, I really want to uplift a long tradition of political education that has really enabled the movements that we see today. The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement that is now 15 years old, the Students for Justice in Palestine. So the wonderful kind of labor of encampments really rests on the shoulders of decades of both knowledge production and political organizing work across difference, as Raz is inviting us to constantly think with, between and among Students for Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voice for Peace, indigenous, indigenous movements, BLM, and many more kind of global struggles for freedom. So please read us, please read Dr. Segal, and thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sherene.
Thank you.